good morning to Yanna and good afternoon to people in Western Europe, or maybe even good evening if you're coming from the eastern part of the world. Welcome to the online Hot Politics Lab. It's cold in the Netherlands right now. We have ice, which makes us all excited, but we're really happy to stay inside this afternoon and be enlightened by Professor Yanna Krupnikov from Stony Brook University. For those of you who are not familiar with Stony Brook University, it is kind of the place we'd like to be in Amsterdam as well. It's a stronghold of political psychology for decades, and Yanna is one of the people really contributing to the current generation of research that's being produced there. Some of her work has appeared in, or most of her work has appeared in impressive outlets such as American Journal of Political Science, Public Opinion Quarterly, and she is the author of an important book on independent politics at Cambridge University Press. Today, Yanna will talk with us about her ongoing project with a bunch of co-authors, among others, Jamie Druckmann, John Ryan, and Matt Lewandowski, and Samara Klaar, on affective polarization. I think I listed them all right. Yes, and so I will stop talking soon. For those of you who are not so familiar with our format, Yanna will talk for about 20 minutes, and then you can ask questions. You can do this by typing them in the Q&A button, and then Gijs will read out the question and Yanna will answer. So without further ado, Yanna, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to present. Just to point out the background behind me, I'm not a very small person with a very large chair. I just do all of my Zooms from the floor of my child's room because that's my pandemic setup. Okay, so let me share my screen here. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about a really kind of large project that we've been undertaking with my co-authors, Jamie Druckmann, Sam Klaar, Matt Lewandowski, and John Ryan. This is hopefully eventually a book project, but for now I'm kind of presenting a couple of parts to you. So everything that you don't like about this is 100% my fault and my presentation, and please do not let it affect. They didn't do it. It's just me. Okay, so I want to start by thinking about partisanship in American politics. This is from the American Political Science Association report on parties in 1950s. And the report said there's no real division in the American electorate. In fact, the crux of the report was we need more partisanship. We need stronger parties. Now, in 2021, that seems very quaint. This is where we're at in partisanship in 2021. This is
Yanna, sorry. I think we still see the first slide. So just,
really?
Yeah.
It's not moving at all?
No. Maybe if you put it to full screen.
It is full screen.
We just see the PDF.
Oh, but then you should share the full screen, and you're sharing the non-full screen.
It's in a different screen, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Do you see something now?
Yeah. Now we see. Yeah.
It would be amazing if I had to screen share every individual PDF slide. That would be quite the thing. Which co-author should I blame for that? Okay, randomly I'll blame John. Okay, so 2021 things look quite different. This is the USA Today saying the country has lost its mind in terms of violence, civil war happening at the polls. So what has happened? That's shared, right? Yes, great. So what has happened? Well, this has happened. Over the last kind of many decades in American politics, we see that people have started to actually very much hate the opposing party. This is the thermometer ranking on a scale of 0 to 100. Ratings of the other party have decreased substantially. Now, you'll also notice that ratings of your own party are also kind of going down a bit, but not as much as ratings of the out party. This is what's now been known as the rise of affective polarization, non-ideological, kind of just intense dislike of the other side, or in terms of what I'm focusing today and what this project focuses on, at the very least, it's the rise of partisan animosity. Now, this partisan animosity has been shown to have a number of consequences. People don't want to spend time with their families. They don't want to date anyone of the opposing party. They don't want to have random college roommates from the opposing party, though, you know, randomness in college roommates is not always great, even when the parties are the same. There are also economic consequences. People don't want to seem to hire somebody of the opposing party. They don't want to collaborate with people of the opposing party. They don't want to kind of even give them money. Now, what you're probably thinking of is, and there are a ton of political consequences. Where are these political consequences? And this is where things get a little bit strange. There are a ton of assumptions made about the way that affective polarization and animosity should affect American politics. And if you have read a lot of papers or reviewed a lot of affective polarization papers, those assumptions are probably located at the end of introductions or in conclusions, right? And they'll say something like, and this is probably very bad for democracy, or this is very bad for issues or voting or rhetoric. But as this terrific paper by Brookman, Calla, and Westwood points out, these are assumptions. We don't really know much. And in fact, in the annual review on affective polarization by Shantu Iyengar, Neil Malhotra, If Lelkis, Matt Lewandowski, Sean Westwood, they also point out the same thing. We don't really know much about the political consequences. And what we do know is a bit complicated. We've seen that animosity might affect voting behavior, trust in government, and there is a correlational relationship between your levels of animosity and your beliefs in democratic norms. Now, this correlational relationship flips depending on which party is in power, but it's there. But on the other hand, Jenny Wolak's book shows that affective polarization doesn't at all affect compromise. This great paper by Mia Costa in the AJPS basically shows that voters are less likely to support candidates who invoke affective polarization. And in kind of the lone causal test of all of this, Brookman, Calla, and Westwood tell us there's actually no effect of affective polarization on democratic values. So what does all of this mean? This, I think, are the theoretical challenges that we're trying to address in this work, because we're trying to create an overarching theory of the role of animosity. And for us, when we see these conflicting results, what it suggests is that the effect must be highly conditional. It must be present sometimes, but not at other times. So in our book project, we're addressing the following challenges. First of all, why do some people have so much animosity for the other party? Why should this animosity matter? Why would we expect that it has these downstream consequences? It's eminently logical that it would, but kind of theoretically wise, why would it? And when will this actually matter for political outcomes? So we make two arguments. The first argument is that animosity is largely a function of beliefs about how much the other side values politics. People have animosity toward the other side because they sometimes incorrectly imagine that the other side is really heavily political. And the second argument we make is that animosity can have political consequences, but it's highly contextual and it's highly conditional. Today, I'm going to talk about this second component, but I'm also happy to talk about the first if anyone has any questions about that. All right, so I'm going to try to do this in 20 minutes. So if I'm missing anything, I'm happy to get into it in the Q&A. I'm going to talk through our theoretic arguments. I'm going to talk about our analytic approach. I'm going to talk about results from first 4 survey waves, brief results from a 5th survey wave, and we are currently designing the 6th wave of our panel survey. We have just started. We have not finalized anything. Nothing is pre-registered yet. So this is kind of a perfect time if you think that we have missed something huge to tell us now. I mean, don't wait until we've tried to publish something. Okay, so where do we start? I'm going to start with something that hopefully I won't need to convince anyone of. There's been enough of literature on this. Partisanship is a social identity. Fine. It's also a really great heuristic. If I don't have any information about you but your partisanship, I can make a lot of evaluations. In fact, we see this effect over and over again in experiments. The only thing people know about somebody else is their party. They're going to make a lot of judgments on this political partisanship. Fine enough. But what we suggest is actually that identity alone is not enough to explain why partisan animus may affect people's behavior, why it's important, and so forth. All of this to say is that there needs to be something else. It's not enough just to say people have these identities and so they don't like the other party. So why is that the case? We suggest that there are going to be, I call them 2.5 conditions in terms of activating animosity. The first is that, in terms of animosity mattering. The first condition is that you need activation. The second, though, is you need clearly divergent elites. And this 2.5 condition here is that you need a context in which there's nothing else that's going to matter to you besides those elite messages. And I'll get into precisely what that means actually with COVID, with the coronavirus. So what is this activation? Partisanship is social identity, but what's interesting about it, it's actually not a central personal identity. It's central for some people, but if you let people rank other identities, partisanship consistently comes in last. Jamie and Matt have shown this effect. It's been replicated in other surveys. Also, in a study by Emily West and Shanto Iyengar, when you made social identity more salient, it had no effect on animosity. So identity alone is not going to be enough. Rather, you need an explicitly political context to activate the fact that your animosity and that your partisanship is going to be important. And once that's activated, a person is going to be motivated to differentiate themselves from the other side. So now I'm conscious of politics. It's gonna become important to me to say, I'm not like those other people. Fine, right, that's where I am. But I need to know what to do with my motivation. If I have no idea what my side is doing or what the other side is not doing, I literally have no place to channel this desire to differentiate. So the next thing I need clear contrasting signals from elites, usually, though it can be from opinion leaders, people who are not elites, ordinary people, let's say on my Twitter, to tell me what the other side does and what my side does. The other thing that's going to be important here is that often in this context of messages and animus, actually it's going to be out-party cues that are going to be stronger than in-party cues. There's an interesting paper by Merkley and Stekula that kind of shows that thing. We are more motivated, right, to show what we're not rather than what we are. This is a t-shirt you could purchase, should you so choose. And that's kind of the differentiating example, right? I may not be perfect, but at least I'm not a Democrat. I may not be perfect, but at least I'm not a Republican. You're showing to somebody what you're not. And all of this is going to be magnified if there's nothing else outweighing partisan cues. So if you're in a context where your options aren't follow Donald Trump's cue and not wear a mask or dying, right? It's going to be much easier to follow the partisan cue. If there's no other threat, nothing else that you experience besides that politics, you're going to be following that elite cue. So in sum, we expect conditional effects of animosity, context matters, elites matter a lot. Our analytic approach is a set of surveys. There's an initial survey in 2019, a COVID survey, an election survey, and an upcoming new administration survey. This is a panel survey, so these are the same people being interviewed over and over again. The COVID survey provides a lot of the conditions that we are kind of trying to test here. There was a lot of activated animosity in American politics. And these are heavily divergent elites. This is Republican and Democratic rhetoric from a paper in Science Advances by Green et al., right? Very different rhetoric on COVID from the two parties. And there's another threat, right? This is also going to be different from people in April when we're doing this study. COVID spread really unevenly through the US. So for some people, the threat of the virus, like for me in New York, was much closer than for somebody who was living in Arkansas at the time. The way that we did this is that we had completed the first survey in the summer of 2019, just because we were doing a different project, and we measured these people's animosity, partisan animus. We used a measure of party animus that combined a bunch of measures. I'm happy to talk through these afterwards, but here's the alpha. We pre-registered that we were going to combine all of them into a certain index, though we have looked at them separately. After COVID kind of started, we ran a survey in April. We had a re-interview of about 74%. We re-asked the thermometer animus for, this is where our correlation. Our COVID outcomes were as follows. It was worry about the virus, a number of questions. We had a list of behaviors and also support for various policies in the US, like closing restaurants, closing schools, and so forth. Now, this approach allowed us to kind of overcome a really big problem in the study of animus, which is causality. Oftentimes, if we measure an issue position and animus at the same time, we have no idea if these two emerge simultaneously. If the issue attitude emerged first, and then you got mad at the other party for holding different positions. When we measured, because we measured something in 2019, we had their animus before COVID ever emerged. So we knew what they were like before this was an issue. We can't rule out that there's some other variable out there that moved both their animus and then later their COVID attitudes, but we can control for other conceivable things. So what we'd expect here is that higher animus should produce higher partisan gaps. Right? It's kind of that conditionality. It's not just that you're partisan, it's that you dislike the other party. But we should also expect that having cases close to you should undermine all of that political activation. It's harder to follow elites once things around you are actually terrifying. Okay, so this is what our partisan results look like. We see partisan differences. This makes sense. Republicans were being told COVID's not a thing, don't do anything about it. Democrats were told by their elites, don't leave your house. So it makes sense that you would see these divergences, but we also see kind of a good amount of overlap. But this is just kind of descriptive. We don't necessarily look at any of our patterns. The next thing we do is we look at animosity. This is the marginal effect of being a Republican, so it's going to give this partisan difference by your level of animosity in 2019. So how are you feeling about COVID in 2020 based on who you were in 2019? And what we see here is this expectation. The differences between parties are larger, they're significant as animus increases. So it's not just partisanship, it's animosity. And I should note, this is just people who identified as partisan as we pre-registered, excluding independents. But we have run these kind of including independents as well. Okay. You have animosity, you have partisanship, you're following your cues. Is there anything that can overwhelm that? right? At what point kind of do elites become not enough? And that point is when things get kind of terrifying around you. So here we present, we look at cases. This is now a triple interaction, which is always a bit difficult to present. So this is how we've chosen to present this here. But I should note some of this is also included in our paper that is recently out in Nature Human Behavior that has an incredibly long appendix with more details on this. So what we see here is that when cases are really low, such as in Iowa in April, when you have high animosity, there's going to be a partisan gap. And this, I should note, is largely among Republicans. When there are no cases around you, it is relatively kind of reasonable to just follow your party, not really do much, and kind of push that partisan gap. We know that the partisan gaps kind of go away. It becomes a flat line in the second panel here when cases around you are pretty large. This is now Erie County, New York. There's no more animosity effect because everyone is actually behaving in a really similar way. There's now a threat. The context has changed. You're not necessarily following the elites. We see the same thing with policy, actually. You're going to be more likely to rely on your cues to differentiate when there's no threat. Now, something different happens with behavior. This is, are you wearing a mask? What are you doing? That kind of thing. We don't get that same effect. A large part of it is that our Democrats ended up ceiling out. Democrats, even when there were no cases, were already doing so much that as cases increased, they couldn't possibly do more. Republicans did do more as cases, as we later kind of thought about it, weren't kind of the best for these sort of measures. One of our behaviors was, have you canceled travel? Well, if you didn't plan any travel, you couldn't really cancel it. And so that is, I think, a function of the way that we measured it. So what does all of this suggest ultimately? It's not just partisanship, right? It's not enough to have a Republican or Democratic identity. It's animus, right? You need to have this level of dislike for the other side. It needs to be activated. You need elite cues. Democrats and Republicans provided really clear cues of how you're supposed to behave during the virus if you're a Democrat or Republican. But a threat close to you could undermine those cues. At some point, the context overwhelms the role of animus. So I'm going to present this briefly. We are going to redo this. We're going to redo this in October, November, right before the election. This is our follow-up panel. We're going to include similar measures to see if we can replicate this effect. And we're going to include nuke measures. The first thing is that we do replicate what I just showed you. It's, again, not just partisanship, it's animus. By this point in October and November, literally every place in the US had a ton of cases because we did a great job. And we were able to, so we moderated it not just by the number of cases, but by the extent to which somebody actually personally experienced it. And we replicated that effect. We also replicated a similar effect for figures who had become really politicized since we first did the study in April. So we especially replicated this effect for Dr. Anthony Fauci, who over the summer had become an incredibly heavily politicized figure, even though he is a scientist. And we also see the effects for scientists. But we also included other measures. We want to kind of make broader theoretical arguments than just about COVID. So we asked questions about election violence, participation, and we included an outcome on which there are no clear partisan cues, mayors. It turns out very few people in the US know who their mayor is, and they don't know the partisanship of their mayor. I looked up our mayor before this talk, and I actually immediately have forgotten that person's name. So, and I could not tell you the party of that person. So there are very few cues there. So what do we see here? first we looked at animus patterns and thoughts of election violence, something that also had become really kind of politically partisan cued, but partisan cued in an interesting way. Both parties were telling Americans that it was the other party that was going to be violent, right? The Republicans were like, Democrats are going to be violent during the election, and Democrats were saying Republicans are going to be violent during the election. So what do we see here in perceptions of election violence? The measure asks, who do you think will engage in violent behavior? First of all, most of our respondents are telling us they're not going to engage in any violent behavior. There's no effect on animus. So even those high in animus are telling us they're probably not really going to engage in unlawful acts and are probably not going to engage in violence. But then we ask them, how likely do you think the other party is going to engage in violence and unlawful acts around the election? And this is what we see. So the higher that you are in animus, the more differentiating yourself you are from the other party. You're saying the other party is going to do all that bad stuff. We also asked about participation more generally, and the mayors. As theoretically we would expect, we see no animus patterns on mayors. There's no clear cue. You don't know what to do. You don't know how to differentiate yourself. So there's really nothing. But the other thing we see is there's no animus patterns on participation. Actually, in a paper by my colleague at Stony Brook University, what matters more is your partisan identity than your animus, which again sort of makes sense. There are no really clear partisan cues. So what matters there more is how strongly you are committed to your partisan side, reinforcing the idea that animus is actually something else. It's not just commitment to partisanship. It's not just commitment to a side. It's more of a difference from the other side. So where does all of this leave us? The consequences of animus are conditional and contextual. The reason we don't see it always, we see it sometimes it works totally differently than we expect, is because it's something that we can't assume is going to work the same way all the time. It needs a context. Elites have a huge role in directing people's animus. You need elites to be clear, to make cues, to do things for the animus to be channeled. Now, to sort of spoiler the first part of the book, people who are opinion leaders and not elites can also create a lot of animus. You don't just need politicians. You need very strong partisans who are very vocal to tell you how a side behaves, to direct this animus. But of course, we're probably missing a lot of stuff. We, of course, have a very American perspective on this as well. So there's probably something we haven't measured, something we haven't considered. So we have this next wave of the survey. I would love to hear any feedback. I have preemptively thanked you all for telling us what to put on this next survey on this last slide. So I would love to hear any feedback that you might have as we kind of finish up putting together what we think is a more cohesive theory of when animus matters. Thank you.
Thanks, Yanna, for a great presentation. It's time for questions now. So if you type your questions into the Q&A box, so that's the box down below in the middle, then I will read them out and Yanna will answer. While we are waiting for the first question to appear, let me ask you a question for clarification, something I didn't get. About the mayors at the very end, you say it's a less partisan situation, but how is that? Because the mayors are Democrats and Republicans, right? So how are they?
Oh, so that's actually, it's actually a learning experience. So, and I'm going to quote directly my co-author, Sam Clark here. So she's actually been coding partisanship of mayors and she cannot find it. She has a whole, in big cities, right? So Chicago, New York City, Philadelphia, easy to find the partisanship of mayor. But most of America is these teeny tiny towns where basically mayors are elected by kind of the number of family members who turned out on that particular day. And it's those tiny towns that a lot of people live in where you actually do not know who your mayor is at all. At Stony Brook, so Stony Brook, for example, where I live, is part of a town of Brookhaven. Then Brookhaven is part of something else, and it would take me forever to find who my mayor is. And even if I did, as Samara's research team has found, they are scouring the web trying to figure out in any way what party these people belong to. So we think of mayors as like somebody who's really, really well known, but most of them are kind of people who've been in it forever who are really unclear.
So Major Pete is not representative of the mayors in the US.
No.
Not only in that account. We have a couple of questions now. First one from Elizabeth Connors. Welcome, Elizabeth. She asks, in addition to comparing states to each other, did you also compare states over time since the risk changed, for example, in New York? And that could control for all the other differences between states.
So I should say we're not looking at states, we have FIPS codes. So we have county level codes and county level data. In terms of looking at it, effects, so we've done it at looking at the rolling average in the FIPS codes. I'm not sure I'm understanding Liz, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question about comparing things, about doing it over time. We've put in that number of cases in different ways. We've done it in a logged effect because New York was actually skewing the entire distribution of cases in April. We've looked at it in terms of rolling average. We looked at it the week prior because we had all the data from the New York Times, which was collecting it at the time. In terms of the wave in, we've controlled for county effects, we've controlled for state effects. In terms of the results that are using the October data, we have also accounted for over time changes as well. So I hope that answers the question.
And if not, please,
yes.
Write a follow-up.
Yes.
We're going to Mia Costa. Thanks for your great talk. Elite cues direction are obviously important as a condition. Do you have a sense of the conditions under which elites will direct those cues? Is it a matter of partisan animus on the parts of elites themselves?
So first of all, Mia, I love your paper. I hope that was clear as I was citing it. The motivations of elites are something that is difficult within this project, in large part because we focus so much on the voters. I would say that given kind of previous research, under certain conditions, especially when there's something that is incredibly challenging, that it's about to be a giant kind of partisan showdown, then I would argue that elites would be motivated to essentially try to direct that animus to really heavily diverge and to really heavily clarify. I think another issue that's happening is that over time, we've seen a greater reliance on base voters in American politics. I think a lot of conditions have exacerbated this reliance on base voters. And I think base voters really thrive on really clear divergence in party positions. I think base voters want to see who we are and who we're not. And so I think so long as certain politicians believe that the only way they can win is to activate the base, no matter how harmful that base is, they're going to be motivated to try to activate the animus.
Yeah, and if I may abuse my position for a little bit, one sort of suggestion I want to give you is, I mean, you mentioned specifically that for the book project might be interesting to look beyond the United States. It would be interesting actually to go back to some of the classic work in comparative politics by Arend Leijpaard, who wrote a a book about the Netherlands being a case of a sort of a highly population with a lot of animus between the different groups that were there, but an elite that chose not to really follow up on this. And then there's some interesting conditions that made this possible. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Adi Wiesel has the next question. Hi, Yanna. This is Adi Wiesel from Arizona State University. Thanks for a fascinating talk. You mentioned that you did not find any effects of animus on participation, but you did find effects for party ID. I was curious if you could tell us a bit more about how you measured participation. Thank you.
I believe we did the standard participation battery. So I believe we, in that aspect of the survey, we were following the Huddy, Mason, and Arrow paper. So we had included their identity measure, and we had included some of the participation aspects that they believe are important. And so in a lot of ways, our finding is a replication of what they did. So we look at intentions to vote, we look at donations, we look at, I believe, protest attendance, contacting your congressperson, and so forth. We included kind of these other measures of participation that are more amorphous in terms of what people think of them, like discussion and sharing on social media. We have actually not looked at those yet because we are behind schedule. So I cannot yet tell you whether those were included as a kind of exploratory components. So we have not done our exploratory component quite yet.
All right, thanks. Next question is from Mathias Rodin. Hi, Yanna, very exciting project. You examine affective polarization along partisan lines. In the US, this is, of course, the core divide. However, affective polarization could also take place along other lines, for example, the Brexit identity in the UK. Do you also examine other in-groups versus out-groups and hence other forms of affective polarization?
So we have not. We had been relying really kind of heavily on previous work, which is in essence focused on again, as you mentioned, partisanship. The closest, and this is not satisfying, this is an unsatisfying answer. The closest we've come to including groups that are typically not included is that we have found ways to include independents, so people who don't have a party, by essentially using who they rank top on thermometer scales. The results stay the same. In terms of how this might apply to other groups, though, I will say that the differentiation aspect, the theoretic arguments that we are looking at, psychologically speaking, should work the same way from other groups, as should the activation. So for example, if I'm entering a room and some other aspect of my identity is activated, and I have an animus toward another outgroup, I should be similarly motivated to differentiate myself from that particular outgroup as well as I would in a partisan line. The key again, though, is that I have really clear messages of how my group now is supposed to behave in that sense.
Thanks. Next question, Neil Moore. What is the link, if any, between affective and ideological polarization? Would it not follow that those who strongly identify with a party also take on that party's policy positions? So
does everyone have 3 hours for the answer to this question? The interesting thing about affective polarization as it has emerged is that it actually emerged as a solution to a puzzle of why do people seem to hate the other party, but don't actually seem all that ideologically polarized? And that's the puzzle of these two things, is that we see this animus, but we don't really see this ideological change. Now, this, of course, again, gets more complicated. There's a really interesting paper by Lila Orr and Greg Huber, which suggests that, well, actually ideology can kind of factor in there. You do dislike somebody else a bit more. There is a fascinating paper in response to that by Nick Diaz and If Lelkes, suggesting under certain conditions, maybe ideology does factor into it. But the separation between ideology and animus is something that is people have been puzzling for a while. To give a plug to another really interesting paper from Liz Connors, who asked the questions earlier. Liz, for example, suggests that it's because socially, people have an easier time pointing out how much they dislike the other party through these animus affective scores than through issues. You know how to say you're not a Democrat or Republican by rating Democrats and Republicans at zeros. If I give you an issue, how do you signal on that issue, especially if it's not very salient or heavily covered? How do you signal that you're not a Democrat or Republican, right? How do you signal you're not a Democrat or Republican on nanotechnology? I don't know. I don't even know how to signal it on my own mayor, it turns out. So part of this, I actually think this divide, these kind of things that we're showing, the need for elite divergence, the need to want to differentiate yourself could speak to this difference between issue and affect. The reason we will see some similarity between animus and issue positions is because sometimes it's going to be very, very clear from elites how you differentiate yourself on an issue. Other times it'll be less so. So we'll see a divergence between animosity and extremity ideologically.
Thanks. Okay, next question is from anonymous attendee. Thank you for the interesting talk. I'm wondering what you think of explaining this lack of animus effect on COVID worry or intentions. Through Dan Keynes' idea that motivated reasoning can be due to survival considerations. Showing you are a good group member helps you survive against the outgroup, maybe until another threat comes that is deadlier than not following the group.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that was it. So,
oh, okay. Yeah, I think that's a really kind of good way of framing it. If there's no threat around you, you can not wear a mask and you can kind of not follow any cues. But exactly, right? That's a really great way of putting it. Once there's survival beyond partisanship on the line, that will overwhelm your partisan tendencies.
Yeah. Next question from Philip Mendoza. Thank you for the really interesting talk and the insights into your new data. I first have one follow-up. I may have missed this, but how do you explain the positive slope of animosity on policy support? Yeah, go ahead. We'll first do this question.
Okay. Well, the confidence intervals do overlap zero. So it's a positive slope, but we have always been very hesitant to make much of the positive slope because it is effectively a null effect. The positive slope kind of happens when there are a ton of cases. And it's largely a result of Republicans becoming quite much more supportive of the policy. But again, I kind of want to say it's a null effect because it's a confidence interval that overlaps zero.
Okay, the second question is, I was wondering about whether we could actually generalize your finding for the moderating effect of threat, given that the COVID threat is that imminent. For which other conditions would you theoretically imagine a threat could actually moderate elite cues?
So as I was putting this presentation together, and a shout out to Jamie Druckman, whose presentation draft I have just cribbed. I actually thought of that very same question, right? So is this threat condition something that has occurred precisely because of COVID? And the answer that I came to last night is yes. That you actually need something as profound as a pandemic to overwhelm those elite cues. which is why I classified that condition as condition 2A, in that it's probably something that's going to occur as very rarely. But the much more generalizable conditions are, of course, the first two, which is politics is going to activate your animus. Elites are going to prey on that by giving you cues to direct your animus. And there we go. I am not speaking, though, for my co-authors. It's possible that if you had them here, they would chime in and say, no, I think there are going to be other cases that are going to kind of threaten people and they're going to overwhelm things. I think if there are these threats, they're probably going to be more individual based. Somebody who is experiencing, for example, a huge economic shock, just that's very personal to them, might overwhelm partisan cues. Anecdotally, this is also kind of COVID based, but slightly less so. For another project, I was reading interviews with women who were anti-vaccine, right? Who'd had personal experiences that then led them, that were threatening, like health-wise threatening, that overwhelmed the cues they were receiving about the vaccine. So I think there could be something personal. But when it comes to a mass measurable happening to a nation context, I think COVID is an important outlier in that respect.
Yeah, war.
Yes, war. I was trying to think positively.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to Ursula Duxiker. Thanks a lot for the great talk. She has two questions as well. First question, do you find that effects are generally symmetric across parties or stronger for Republicans?
The effects are not symmetric. They are a bit stronger for Republicans, except, I don't want to get this wrong. I think except on behavior, we get kind of odd relationships for Democrats. But that's because Democrats from day one just are doing so much stuff, right? So in some ways, Democrats are a bit ceilinged out, but we do see some stronger effects of behavior changes amongst Republicans.
Okay. Second question, on your election violence measure, did you ask people if their own party would engage in violence versus the out party? Or did you ask if they themselves would engage in violence versus the out party?
So we do ask if they themselves would engage in violence. And that's kind of a flat line. They don't necessarily, they're saying they're not going to. We have another measure where, because we think it's kind of unclear about what it means to, when you're saying, are you going to engage in these things? What does it mean? We break it down for them in terms of behaviors that they could take that would be unlawful or violent. We don't find any particular effects there. We ask about the out party. We ask about the in party, and I believe everyone assumes their in party is not going to do anything. That if anything happens, it's going to be the out party.
Okay, Claire. Next question, Katerina Laval. Do you measure directly how respondents perceive the positions of in and out party elites? I think it would be interesting to see how certain respondents are correctly identifying elite positions, and also about how either all these difficult words, heterogeneous or homogeneous, they perceive their in-party elite positions to be.
That's great. I think we should do that. I think we will do that on in wave 6. We do measure what they perceive the positions and extremity of out party voters to be. And I will say that most everyone overestimates how extreme out party voters are, and they also overestimate how engaged with politics the out party voters are. So the modal person in our sample is different from who they imagine the other party to be, right? So the modal out partisan in our sample is somebody who doesn't talk about politics much, and somebody who's not all that well sorted politically, not all that extreme. Something like 65% of our people in the sample imagine that the out partisan is very extreme and talks about politics all the time. So there is kind of a strong overestimation of how heavily engaged somebody is with politics.
Okay. Next question, Dirk de Cleer. Thank you so much for your presentation. Considering the pro and anti-Trump factions of the JOP, do you think that intra-party animus becomes increasingly more important to consider in research on US polarization?
Yes, 100%. There is a really cool paper by Eric Gronendijk, Carol Zherkov, and Michael Sansis that looks at, it's one of the few papers emerging that looks at intra-party differences. It's in the JOP, I think it's just out. So that aspect, I think intra-party divisions are extraordinarily important to look at. There is, if we're talking specifically about the Republicans in the GOP, I do think there's an immense challenge to doing that right now, and that challenge is a survey sampling challenge. Whenever something happens like this, we see really interesting shifts in who's willing to identify with the party. So my hunch is that currently there are a lot of Republicans who are saying they're independents, or a lot of Republicans who aren't taking surveys because they don't necessarily want to talk about their own party. So I think to study these factions, we will have to overcome a potential survey issue. And that survey issue might be is that a lot of Republicans are currently telling us they're independents. So to get at that intra-party divide, we'd have to figure out which independents are actually Republicans who are a bit too embarrassed to admit it at this moment.
Okay. Let me go to Neil Fushing's question. I was wondering if you found differences between parties. Was there more animus between members of one party relative to the other? And what about independents?
Okay. So in terms of differences in animus, they were somewhat similar. If we had to track it, like if we had to put one party slightly above, there was actually somewhat more animus on our measure amongst the Democrats than amongst the Republicans. The reason, though, that there's less affective polarization amongst the Republicans is because by the time we were doing our surveys, the Republicans hated their own party so much that was kind of, I think, offsetting something. So the Democrats liked their own party better, like the Republicans less. So there was a bit more animus amongst them. When you include independents, the way to look at it is that you can just kind of take the absolute value of the difference and how they rate the two parties, essentially, to get at that animus. It is amongst independents who don't lean to a party, it is, of course, lower. Amongst independents who do lean to a party, they're already embedded and it's going to be higher because those leaning independents are probably just partisans. Sorry, leaning independents.
Okay, we still have a lot of questions and we're also running a bit out of time. So let me select a question. Alberto Stefanelli from KU Leuven. He writes, Westwood, Peterson, and Locust show that after 2016 Trump's election, polarization in the US mass public has not paralleled increases in elite and policy polarization, and negative party effect has remained overwhelmingly stable in the US mass public. This implies that elite cues did not move voters' attitudes by much. How can we explain this result given Trump's highly conflictual presidency? Does this mean that the general public has reached a limit on outpartisan's negative evaluation?
So first of all, I've enjoyed this and that I also get to say all the time, that's a great paper. I love that paper. I love that paper. That's a terrific paper. I think that we are hitting 2 points in American politics. And I think the 2 points are this. I think there's a group of voters for whom this animus has become much more embedded in their lives. They can't go up the scale anymore, but they do feel it really deeply. I think there's another issue, and I think Trump's conflictual presidency does kind of make things different from those people. I think they might be willing to do more political things. They might be willing to say more things that they wouldn't otherwise have been. I do think that the reason we haven't seen it go up on average is that there are people who are becoming essentially disengaged from politics, not just as a result of Trump, but as a result of those highly affectively polarized people. So I'm actually, I was supposed to submit a book manuscript today, but it's fine. I'm going to submit it on Monday. That is looking at people who are deeply involved in politics and those who are not. And that's where I think you get this difference. On average, we're not going to see these shifts, because I think on average, there aren't more Americans who are that heavily polarized as the Westwood et al. Paper suggests. But I think for a certain group of Americans, this animus has become just so much more all-consuming in ways that we're not necessarily seeing on surveys.
If you can give a quick answer, then I can squeeze in one more question, and then we need to round it off. Oh, this is all talk a little bit more. That sounds long. Okay, so this question, Luana Rousseau, do you build on the work of Liliana Mason of super-identity in order to explain levels of animosity?
I mean, we certainly cite Lily's work. I don't necessarily, I would say our goal is to, in some sense, differentiate from identities in that way. I would say that we build more on the psychology of sort of self-differentiation, in part because, and we kind of from work by people who are allowing for the rankings of identity. So I think pivotal to our work is Amber Spry's work on the idea of ranking identities to determine which identities are really important. So we think that Lily's work on sorting is kind of pivotal, and it allows us to track the shape of partisanship. But in terms of identities, we are more looking at works by Elmer's and Taylor and Amber's work in terms of sort of situating it in terms of how people perceive themselves relative to other identities.
All right, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Yanna, for this wonderful talk and the many questions you've gone through and fast paced. There's still a bunch of questions that we were not able to track, but we'd like to still keep the tradition of ending on time. So I want to thank you on behalf of Gijs and also all other participants today for this fascinating talk. And we look forward to seeing some of this work coming out in a book or earlier in some of the papers that come out of this. Maybe let me use the last few minutes to advertise a couple of the upcoming talks that we have. So next week we have Michael Bruter from the LSE, who does work on how voting booths should look like and how your posture in the voting booth might matter. March 5th, we have Gerben van Kleef, who's a professor of psychology, doing really important work on leadership and psychological traits. On March 12th, we have Ben Rouge, who's a psychologist from the University of Leiden, doing work on the psychological makeup of liberals and conservatives. On March 19th, we have Lou Safra, who is from Sciences Po, and does work, among other things, about the facial characteristics. And March 26th, we have our two graduate students, Sanne van Oost and Christian Piepal, presenting some of her work. So if you are new today, which we've seen some new names, you can sign up to our mailing list, and then we keep you up to date on some of the talks. You can always listen in or watch Yanna's talk again or other talks on YouTube or Spotify. I want to wish you a really good rest of your day, which is either short or long, but regardless, we'll hope to see you again. Thanks a lot.
And thank you so much, everyone. This was amazing. Thank you.